All right, all right. G'day, dear viewers. Welcome back to Ross and Jono as we continue to discuss the infamous Shapira Saga. We are, of course, going through the textbook, Ross's book, The Moses Scroll, which is available on Amazon in paperback, hardcover, Kindle, and now an audio version. And we are in chapter 9. We're going through the saga once again, not just with this book, but with additional information that we want to pad out the details with. And so chapter 9 is entitled, Ross, the Thou Dost Protest Too Much, a little bit Shakespearean.
That's right.
There.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
We find out why. But before we get into, and as we indicated last week, we were going to be talking about speaking of infamous, Monsieur Clermont-Ganneau.
Charles Simon Clermont-Ganneau.
How many names does he have?
Oh, he's got like
Monsieur
a string
Charles
of
Simon
names.
Clermont-Ganneau.
He's at least
he's
got
a
at
very
least
important
4.
man, Ross.
Yeah, he's important.
He's a very important man.
Just
we're going
ask
to find
him.
out why. But before that whole part of the saga kicks off, you begin the chapter like this, and I'm just going to read this if that's okay.
All right. Yeah, that's fine.
And we have discussed this before, but I have a couple of questions. So it begins by saying, 45 days after first laying eyes on Shapira's manuscript in the Hotel in Germany, Hermann Goethe wrote the foreword to a 95-page booklet that explained his assessment of the 16 leather strips. The work was entitled Fragments of a Leather Manuscript Containing Moses' Last Words to the Children of Israel.
Yep.
Goethe divided his exposition into 5 sections: a foreword, a description, origin of the manuscript, the text of the leather manuscript and of Deuteronomy, the character of the text, remarks about the text. The booklet was also featured a hand-drawn table containing Goethe's presentation of the letters taken from the most readable columns of the manuscript, namely fragments D and E.
Right.
So this is like a table of the Paleo-Hebrew letters, because they do vary a little bit to what they had been collecting prior to this document coming to their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Although Goethe and Meyer had examined the fragments in July, the booklet would not appear until September, and even then would receive little notice. Nonetheless, the German scholars were the first to complete a thorough examination of the Moabite scroll. Okay, so before I ask you about the foreword and the date that it was published, you have, just to remind everybody, and you published an English version for the first time.
Yep.
What, about a year or so ago?
Right.
You've got it there. Can you show everybody that?
Yep. Right here.
Okay, and that's available on Amazon.
That's right.
Okay,
Yep.
So tell us about, just again, just give us a heads up on what that is. And the question is, does the foreword, like we already know, and as we discussed last week, that the winds were beginning to change. We were talking about that cloud that was growing on the horizon, and then all of a sudden the winds were picking up and it was getting darker and the lightning was starting to flash from it. And it culminates in Clermont-Ganneau. We're about to have that. But the scholars were detecting, and Neubauer, Sayce were sort of that precursor force of the approaching storm. What I'm wondering is, do you think that Hermann Goethe picked up on these winds of change? Like he saw where all of the academics and scholars, the position that they were taking, was his forward catering to that wind direction, if you like?
Not in England.
After then.
Not in England.
Not in England.
We don't believe it was in England. Because here's what happens later. A few weeks later in the press, there's this big fight back and forth where sometimes you get the Germans are saying, or the English are saying, hey, we just caught wind that the scroll was in Germany and you determined that it was fake and you left us here to figure this out on our own. Why didn't you tell? So it's like they don't really know what's going on in the other part of the world. I mean, they're close enough, of course, but what we do think, if you read the author's foreword, if you read Goethe's foreword, he says from the opening page that he's determined, after careful consideration, that this is a forgery. Now, we know this is August 14th if we go by the date, but what we do know is that just not even 30 days ago, we have records of these conversations back and forth. He's clearly believing that it's authentic. We believe, and I'll lay forth the case, that he was encouraged, if you will, we're going to see this in the English side as well, to side on the side of forgery. And so I think more than being influenced by the winds out of England, he's clearly influenced by the winds that blew in from Berlin. You see, that's where the senior scholars in Berlin, we think, basically said, hey, young man, you're a great scholar. You want to work in Germany? I think you ought to know how this thing ought to go.
Be a great scholar? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fine. So let me ask you, because I just picked up on something else that you just said. The Berliners are not sharing or not sending forward, like they know that Shapira is now going to London. He turned down the offer that they made him an offer for the scroll, whilst also saying, we don't think it's real, but hey, we'll give you some money for it. And he's like, no, I'm going to take it to London and see if I can get a reasonable price there, because what you're offering me clearly is not reasonable. So they know that he's heading there. Why do they not? Are they secretly thinking, it'd be funny if they buy in on this and we've declared it to be a forgery? Do you think that's what it is, or why have they not sent word?
It's a great question, and you have to wonder what is going on here. Why is it that word isn't sent from Germany? Now, let me say that we know Franz Delitzsch. You've used his some of his works in the library there where you do your research. Franz Delitzsch says in some material from this time that he warned his friends in England that Shapira was headed that way with this forged manuscript. He says he did. He says he did, but what we don't have is any record. We have no record on the English side that they received a friendly letter from Franz Delitzsch saying, hey, here comes a forgery coming your way, coming in hot. We don't have any of that. Nor do we have any English person who steps up and says the same from the English side. So, there could be, and this is the allegation of the newspaper reporters of the time, they know that the Germans got egg on their face with the Moabitica. Because remember, once the Germans bought the Moabitica and it was declared false, one of the things that happened that really threw things off was they saw the Germans get tore up by everybody and anybody. And so it's interesting that, are they just waiting? Are they hoping that this goes through? Are they hoping that it happens to them? Are they hoping it's payback, basically?
Okay, so speaking of payback and the newspaper reports, it must be, I'm to understand that Clermont-Ganneau is in France, and he... Oh, 1 second. Do you think?
Say that again, Jono?
Does he see, Clermont-Ganneau, does he see the notoriety that the scroll is receiving, the limelight that the scroll is receiving via the newspaper reports that are filtering their way to France?
Now, he is.
Is he in France? And he is,
yes. Yeah. Okay. He is clearly watching from a distance. Now, remember, he's not a good friend of Shapira. In fact, it feels like he is really against Shapira every turn. And so what's strange to me is he's just waiting to pounce. That's what's going on here. At least it's what it looks like. Yeah.
Now he's a party crasher. Is it fair to say?
He is.
He crashes the party. He's not invited. No one's invited him. We're dealing with Berlin, we're in Leipzig, we're in Germany, and now we've moved on to London. London, there's a whole lot of fanfare. There's an enormous amount of press. The Prime Minister comes to visit, this and that, and reports of this are spreading around the world because it's a major deal. Evidently, just across the pond into France. And Clermont-Ganneau is like, hang on, what? This is getting all the limelight, and I'm not involved. I should be involved. I'm the expert on all of these things. Why didn't you invite me to the party? So he invites himself. He invites himself. He travels across the channel, and he just arrives unannounced and says, roll out the red carpet, because I'm here to examine the scrolls and set all of you peasants in order.
One slight amendment to what you just said is a slight change. He at least claims that it's like he's sitting there and he's watching. He's watching everyone is showering praise. It looks like some might actually think this is real. He is clearly decided in his mind already, before he's ever seen this, he's decided that it's fake, because he's still thinking back on the Moabitica. But notice in the book, one of the things that I report, and this is from Clermont-Ganneau's words, he says, his moment arrived, this is me saying, his moment arrived when the French Minister of Public Instruction dispatched him to London on a special mission to examine Mr. Shapira's manuscript, at present deposited in the British Museum, and which have for some time past excited such great interest in England. Now, he admits though that he's already decided before he leaves, but he is assigned, go get him, Clermont-Ganneau, go get him, Charles Simon Clermont-Ganneau, you man with many names.
Let me ask you. So, do you think that this is done at the request of Clermont-Ganneau? Has he gone to the powers that be and say, "I should be there to set the record straight"?
That's what I feel. That's what I feel.
Yeah.
I feel like he probably has. He doesn't say that's the way it went down.
Because my question is, what is the? Yeah, well, no, but what is the motivation for the French authorities to send him? What does it achieve for them?
The only thing I could think of, if we were to take this at face value, is everyone wants their expert involved in this case. This is the biggest news in biblical scholarship. Look, the English are clearly looking into it. It's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, though, because the Germans seemingly don't know what the English seemingly don't know that it's already been presented to the Germans. But now that it's in England, and the papers around the world are covering this, see, to my knowledge, we don't know that it really hit the papers in Germany. It's almost like this was sort of a quieted down version in Germany. He goes to Leipzig, he goes to Goethe himself, and then Goethe and Meyer go to the Hotel Hoffa and meet with Adolf Ehrman. Yeah. So it's not really but this is in the middle of London.
Said, just keep this in the circle. Keep it in the circle. Don't tell anyone else. I don't want anyone else involved. Let's just deal with this as a tight-knit group. Yeah. Which really is what they did to their credit. I think there's probably fair reason for that. Monsieur Charles Simon Clermont-Ganneau arrived in London on the 15th of August, 1883, and went straight away to the British Museum. And of course, Ross, do tell how they rolled out the red carpet for Clermont-Ganneau. Dr. Samuel Birch, actually. Who is this?
So Dr. Birch is a guy he's an expert. He is an expert in Egyptology primarily. He's an antiquarian, but he's been in this position with the British Museum for half a century. I mean, this guy is the man at the British Museum. He's clearly an expert's expert. But he also happens to be the guy in the antiquities department that he's 70 years old. He's manning the desk, it seems, and Clermont-Ganneau shows up. He just arrived, and he walks straight to Dr. Birch and says, "Hey, where's this thing going down?" And Dr. Birch said, "Well, come on, Monsieur Charles Simon Clermont-Ganneau. Let me bring you and introduce you to the guys that are working on it. You know, Dr. Ginsburg and Shapira." Now, what happens is when you read the accounts, Jono, the tension had to be like you could cut it with a knife. Imagine, if you will, Clermont-Ganneau walks into the room, and in this room, back away from public view in this office, it seems that Shapira and Ginsburg happen to be together at this point when he walks in. There's no love between these guys. Shapira, I have to imagine, and it's almost said in such, he despises Clermont-Ganneau, who's basically tried to ruin his life, but Ginsburg doesn't like him anymore. I happen to have read the version, the book on the Moabite stone that Ginsburg put out. And Ginsburg basically blames young Clermont-Ganneau for the destruction of the Moabite stone. And I do too, by the way.
Right.
He involves
Yeah.
himself into this situation and causes the ruckus that ends up being the destruction of this ancient monument. And so they're not friends. And Dr. Birch obviously says, hey, guys, look who just showed up. And I'm sure there was almost a fake sense of cordiality among them. You know, they're trying to be professional. And what then happens is Clermont-Ganneau eases himself up to the table, and he's looking, and on the table are these fragments they're working on, and he wants to involve himself. Did you have a question? I know you've read this section recently.
No, I was just going to say it's so funny because he's just invited himself to the party, and I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of Shapira and Ginsburg, and they'd be like, "Who's it? Oh
no! Look who's here!" Yeah.
And are you telling me that in writing, Ginsburg pinned the destruction of the Moabite stone upon Ganneau,
yes,
for fueling the frenzy?
Yes.
I mean, that's really what he did, isn't it? He fueled the frenzy, and Ginsburg identified that.
Yeah, he says that he had a lack of discretion, you know, and he talks about him, how he's a young, sharp scholar, but a lack of discretion. And what he really blames him for is, he says, look, others were working on the acquisition of this, but you butted in and caught. So here he is now in August. Now, remember, Ginsburg has been working on his scroll. He's been deeply engaged in the scroll since the last week of July. So it's 2.5, 3 weeks into this, and he's the guy. He's the only scholar who's had this much time invested in it. In fact, this week, according to the chronology of the book, he's going to release his second installment of the text. And here comes Clermont-Ganneau, and he wants to involve himself. So he says, can I look? And Ginsburg allows him to take a brief look at it, but you can tell he wants him out of the room. And he says, listen, I'm so involved in this thing, I just don't think it's going to be feasible for you to do an investigation too. Now, Clermont-Ganneau tries to assure him, and he says, listen, I understand the way this works. It's your baby. These are my words, you're going to publish. I know that. Everybody knows that. All I want to do is focus on the external elements of it. Now, see, here's what he's thinking. He's thinking a mere look at this. I am Clermont-Ganneau. I can detect a forgery. He believes that the external...
Hang on, wait. You said last week that you were going to do a French accent for us.
I am Clermont-Ganneau. I am fully capable. Yeah, that's about as good as it gets. Sorry. But, so he thinks that if he can just have a little more time. So what they do to get him out of the room with them initially is they say, listen, if you come back Friday, if you come back a couple of days from now, we'll be at a different place, and we'll consider allowing you to look at this. So that's what happens. He leaves. So this is the 15th when he comes. On the 16th, now he goes away. Now, on the 16th, on Thursday, this piece appears in the Liverpool Daily Post. So this is in the newspaper the day after Clermont-Ganneau leaves. He's going to come back tomorrow, hoping that the boys let him work on the scroll. Dr. Ginsburg, it says, is still busily engaged at the British Museum in deciphering Mr. Shapira's latest antiquarian find. And the reticence Dr. Ginsburg displays leads many to put faith in the original assertion that these scraps of leather are hundreds of years older than the Christian era. It is argued by these believers that if the skins had been forgeries, such an acute scholar as Dr. Ginsburg would have been able long before this to have detected the fraud. Now, here's what they're picking up on. They're picking up on what he's putting out. Think about this. Just the day prior, 2 days prior to Clermont-Ganneau arriving, remember, we talked about this in the last episode. We have the Prime Minister, Gladstone, is seen in the interview, the newspapers report that he's there talking with Shapira and Ginsburg. There's no mention of a fake. They're talking about, if I look at the text here, the script looks similar to the Siloam inscription, in a way, similar to this, and they're having this conversation. Remember, Ginsburg is a recipient of a 500-pound stipend from the Prime Minister, so he's not going to drag him along, because, what happens if your cash cow finds out that you didn't tell him that it was a fake when you could have, you see? So the people are beginning to wonder, hey, if this thing were real, or if this thing were fake, Dr. Ginsburg would have told us by now. That's the thought.
Surely by now. On Friday, Clermont-Ganneau returned to the museum where he was informed with, quote, great regret, Ross, by Edward Bond. So Bond is the secretary of the museum?
Bond is the principal librarian. Yeah, he's the top guy at the library there.
That Mr. Shapira had, quote, expressly refused his consent for him to inspect the fragments.
Right.
How much his nose must have been put out of joint by that.
Oh, my God.
The only opportunity to him is what? To view it with all the peasants.
Wait, listen to this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to kind of underline what you just said, he is fuming. He is fuming. I wish I could do his French accent, but here's what he says. He writes this later in his report about how mad he is. He goes, there was nothing to be said against this. In other words, the refusal to look at the owner was free to act as he pleased. It was his strict right, but it is also my right to record publicly this refusal, quite personal to me, and this to some extent is the cause of this communication. I leave to public opinion the business of explaining the refusal. I will confine myself to recalling one fact with comment. It was Mr. Shapira who sold spurious Moabite potteries to Germany, and it was Monsieur Clermont-Ganneau who 10 years ago discovered and established the apocryphal nature of them, you see. So he's like, look, I'll leave it to you to decide why Shapira's not letting me look at his scroll, but I'm just going to give you this one comment. It was me who found the forgery.
What could be, and he clearly posits, what would be the motivation for denying me access to examine the scroll myself, if not the fact that Shapira was involved in forgery in the past, and that not I, but refers to himself in the third person, Clermont-Ganneau, probably used all four of his names. Oh no, Monsieur Clermont-Ganneau, who 10 years ago discovered, and he's got tickets on himself, this guy.
That's
seriously.
right.
All right, so fine.
So now you mentioned this, and I pulled us back into time for a second, but so at this time in the King's Library, there's a display. And in the display, and I've been to the King's Library. I went with the Tylers a couple of years ago, and this King's Library, we went in there, and they still have the display cases from the 1880s, and I took photos by these. So in this dimly lit, and they're still dimly lit, by the way, dimly lit display case, two columns of text were in that display case. Now, mamas with their kids and, all the little, people, the common folk, cleaned up for the day and went to the museum, and they're all looking at it. They paid their admission. And here is Monsieur Clermont-Ganneau, the great, the scholar. He's in line with, Miss Bessie and her 4 kids picking their nose, trying to get up to the counter to see the scroll. He is furious at this. He ought to be, Jono, in the back with the scholars. That's why he's so mad. He is furious.
He says he was devoted to this unpleasant task both Friday and Saturday. So he subjected himself to it twice and stood in line, got close enough to the dimly lit case and scrutinize it as best he could. And from there, he begins to formulate his official response for us.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, so he spends the 2 days in this unpleasant task. He's working on it. Now, one thing that I have to put together just from reading the whole story from all the different angles, it appears that he must have, that Clermont-Ganneau must have spoken to Bond. And the reason I say that is Bond writes a letter to Ginsburg. Now, remember, Ginsburg is in his employ. So he's basically writing an employee. And here's what he says. We'll read parts of it if we need to in a moment. But what he basically says is, hey, Dr. Ginsburg, Augustus Bond here, your boss. I just interrupting your day just momentarily to let you know I'll be going out of town this weekend. I'm going to the country. And, I'm just thinking that the winds are beginning to blow. The experts are beginning to sense that there's some problems with the question around authenticity. But I know that you will make your own mind up. So he says, let me give you a few points. Here's one of the things he writes in Jono. For myself, says boss to employee, I regard the account of the first discovery of the fragments as altogether unsatisfactory. By the way, that means that Bedouin found an ancient scroll in a cave by the Dead Sea. That is totally ridiculous,
We can't
right?
have that. Yeah,
And
that's silly.
consider that the condition of the manuscripts is incompatible with exposure to atmosphere for a long period indicated by the character of the writing. I'm also of the opinion that the setting of the text in widely separated columns between ruled lines is a later character than the period indicated by the writing. And I have little doubt, though, that your critical examination of the manuscripts in respect to the text will lead to the same conclusions as that. And then he says, I think I'm going to head to the country now. I look forward to your decision. And he leaves.
Back at it. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so what you're saying and the way that you read this, quite obvious. I never really picked up on this before, but he's on his horse, and before he goes, he says to Ginsburg, you're my employee.
Yeah.
This is how I feel about it. I mean, I know that you've been at this for like 3 weeks now. Has it been 3 weeks?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You've been examining it?
Yeah.
You've been examining this with great detail over the period of 3 weeks. I haven't been. I've got my job to do as well. Nevertheless, I've made up my mind about it because Neubauer, Stacey, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm sure you'll agree with me in the end.
Yeah.
All right, I'm off. That's what you're saying. So I can see that now. I mean, that's quite obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is. And it seems to me that Bond must be anticipating. Like, it's almost like he knows that this is about to drop, that the hammer is about to smash, and he wants to be ready. See, before now, it's been 3 weeks, and Bond and Ginsburg are both benefiting from the publicity. Bond is the principal librarian. It's taking place under his watch, and the brilliant scholar, I mean, for God's sake, the Prime Minister of Great Britain just came. I mean, it's good for them. It's good for the museum. It's good for both. But now he feels the heat. It's like, let's say, this is what I think. I think he knows that Clermont-Ganneau is going to press. I think Clermont-Ganneau, who's quite arrogant, and I think he said, "You wait, Bond. You wait. They didn't want to let me in. I'm going to ruin it. It is fake. I will prove it. It's coming out soon." I think he did that because of the way that Bond writes this letter. I don't know. It just feels like that. And so, sure enough,
it is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, he heads out. And then Clermont-Ganneau, as you said, over the weekend, Friday and Saturday, he spends in the dimly lit cabinet, and he determines everything that we're about to talk about. Not only does he determine that it is a forgery, but he knows how it was done to some degree. He knows who did it and the way in which, and by the way, I've got some show and tell I'm going to pull into the screen, into the picture in a few minutes. But he's got it figured out, he thinks. And he even says, since I'm not allowed to get up close and handle this, should someone who is permitted do the simple test that I lay out, you will immediately see that this is a forgery. And by the way, later he gets a chance to do that and he doesn't even follow, but that's for later. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we will get into that, but it is also an interesting thing, and I think, again, this is an indirect dig at Ginsburg. He lets everybody know not only his conclusions, but prior to the conclusions, I only had Friday and Saturday, and I was in a dimly lit room, and I had to, look at these, but you know what? Even in that small amount of time that I had to look, Ginsburg's been at it for 3 weeks, but I, the great Clermont-Ganneau, have cast my eyes upon, and I can clearly see like that, Russ. This is clearly let me tell you what it is. In the short space of time that I've had to examine it, here's my conclusions. Why has Ginsburg taken so long?
That's exactly right, Jono. That is exactly what, in fact, he says as much in just a little while. We'll get into that. But one of the things that happens also that I want to use to kind of contrast this is that one of the things we read in Goethe's work, when Goethe takes, they only have a week. But one of the things that he says is that this is Goethe, a conscientious scholar would rather not pass a judgment until he had achieved a consummate understanding of the entire manuscript through equally precise examination of all the parts thereof. That would be a work not to be achieved in a few days, but would rather demand weeks or even months. Now, I find this interesting. So here's Goethe, he looks at it, and we're to believe that he determined in really 4 days of work, only 4 at best. And remember, one of those days it was storming so bad, so you're down to 3.5 maybe days, just a few hours a day. But he said, look, I'm looking at this to determine the question of authenticity would take weeks or months. He doesn't even do that. And Clermont-Ganneau had 2 days, admittedly, in line with children and common folk.
With the crowd around him.
Yeah.
Ginsburg said something similar to Goethe too, didn't he? Didn't Ginsburg also write that the document should be afforded the kind of attention it deserves before coming to a conclusion?
That's right.
Are these digs at Ganneau, or these were written prior to Ganneau's hasty examination?
Yeah, prior. And I really think my view is that Ginsburg believed that they were authentic for a whole host of reasons. I really do. Now, he will later say, I knew from the very beginning that they're fake. But that's after the winds have blown through. And he even tells family members. He tells his daughter Ethel in a letter September of 1883, look, I knew it was fake from the beginning, but, I guess people can lie to their kids. But here's the thing. This is a big scandal that's beginning to boil up. So Ginsburg is steady working. He gets this letter from his boss that says, hey, I think you probably ought to, I know I trust you, but just to let you know, I think it ought to be deemed a fake. He goes out of town. Clermont-Ganneau's about to publish. And then here's what happens. The report comes out from Clermont-Ganneau, and he gives his conclusions, and basically he describes a certain situation, which if you have questions, I'm going to slide into the picture here a Torah scroll that's here at my office, and let me get this where you can see it.
Go ahead.
Go ahead if you have questions.
Whilst you're grabbing that. Okay, beautiful. Oh, this is good.
Yeah.
Okay. Because there is an illustration, figure 10, illustration of
That's right.
Clermont-Ganneau's theory that you put in your book, and it's beautiful. It's this one here.
That's right.
Let me just ask you, where did this illustration come from? Who commissioned this?
It is from Clermont-Ganneau. It was later published. It was published later. I brought it into the book at that point to illustrate his theory. Now, what he says is this, in a nutshell. By the way, this particular scroll here at the office, you've seen it, is and it's from 1898 from Calcutta, India. It's referred to as a Sephardic roll. Now, if you were to count the lines of text here, you'll come up with 51 on an individual sheet from here to here on a Sephardic style. You're going to have 51 lines of text. Now, in this is according to what the scribes are required to do. Now, this is off when it comes to, this is not the same as we find at Qumran. But notice at the top here, you have a space between the top of the scroll and the first line of letters here. And then you have a space below the last line, line 51, and the bottom. Now, if you notice at the top, the distance is a little bit slack of what we have here. There's a little bit more on the bottom. But if you measure this, like I have a handy ruler, because you never know when you're going to see a scroll and have to make a measurement. So I didn't want to blow it. I got too close to my mic. But what we have basically is that if I measure this, the block of text,
the bottom portion,
you get a certain measurement, and then if you measure from the last line of text to the bottom, you get a certain measurement, and it's a little over 3 inches on the bottom, this distance here. Yep.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is that generally uniform in the production of a scroll, or do the white spaces above and below vary greatly?
They vary, but when you deal with this particular scroll, my understanding is that this style, this Indian Sephardic style, you're going to see about the same thing. The scribes in this tradition generally uniform. Number of lines, the distance, and so forth. Now, what Clermont-Ganneau proposes is that if you are a forger and you take, say, a scroll that you happen to own, and he goes, do we have anyone around here that deals in scrolls? Oh, Shapira deals in scrolls. Maybe he took one of his scrolls that he didn't want to sell. And maybe he whacked off the bottom portion. Now, he's going to have to do enough of it to get his scroll. But I want people to understand that this is slightly narrower, slightly more narrow than what we know about the measurement of the Shapira scroll. So this is rough.
So let me just say that again, what you just said. Generally speaking, the bottom white section of a traditional scroll is narrower than what we understand the Shapira scrolls to be. In other words, the Shapira scrolls are wider, significantly wider than your average white space at the bottom of a Torah scroll. Is that your point?
Yeah. And so here's what we know because Hermann Goethe is so precise in his description. He says that the width varied from 7.6 centimeters to 9.7 centimeters in width. Or height, you might say. Height, I guess you would say. In other words, here is my mock-up of the scroll. And this is about the right size. So this is about, now some people might say, well, golly, that's got to be a forgery. He probably is right. Maybe he did just cut off the bottom of this scroll. But it's not as easy to say that as it might seem, especially now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, because some of the Dead Sea Scrolls have similar measurements, and so it's not so easy. A couple of other things that he said. He said that he noticed that there were scoring marks along the outside edge of the text block. So on either side, there's a score mark here, and there is on my scroll as well. And we find those even among the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see vertical lines that go from top to bottom, and at times, of course, in modern scrolls or more recent scrolls, you have horizontal lines that have to do with keeping the lettering straight. So a scribe who's preparing a scroll will score it vertically, score horizontally the right dimensions, and then stay within that block. At Qumran, we don't always see uniformity. We don't always see score marks, but we do. We do see score marks, vertical score marks at times. We even see, among some of the scrolls, but not all, horizontal marks. Now, one of the things that Bond tells Ginsburg in his Going to the Country letter is, I think this ruling thing comes way later than the text claims to be. But see, they didn't know. They had no idea.
They had nothing to base it on. Yeah.
They had nothing to base it on. That's right. So the allegation is that this is cut off from the bottom. Now, there's a lot more to it, but he basically, here's a description. This is from Clermont-Ganneau in his own words. These are my conclusions. The fragments are the work of a modern forger. Now this, by the way, you believe this if you want, this is not the expression of an a priori incredulity, a feeling which many scholars must, like me, have experienced at the mere announcement of this wonderful discovery. In other words, I didn't have my mind made up first, but we know he did. He already said he did. I am able to show with the documents before me how the forger went to work. He took one of those large synagogue rolls of leather containing the Pentateuch, written in square Hebrew character and perhaps dating back 2 or 3 centuries. By the way, mine is from 1878. So, it's
Well, yeah, no, I was going to say, because yours, as you mentioned, is a decommissioned scroll, but not all decommissioned scrolls are treated with such respect as you treat yours, keeping it in the case, and I know you're very protective of it, as you should be. But many ancient scrolls have been discovered, standing upright and exposed.
That's right.
And decaying at the bottom.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Over many centuries. So there is that. Keep going.
Yeah, so the forger probably took a scroll, goes back a couple of centuries, rolls which Mr. Shapira must be well acquainted with, for he deals in them. You catch that? And has sold several to public libraries of England, sundry copies obtained from existing synagogues of Judea and of Yemen. Then the forger cut off the lower margin of this roll, which offered him the widest surface. This way he obtained some narrow strips of leather with an appearance of comparative antiquity, which was further heightened by the use of proper chemical agents. So he makes it look older, right? And on these strips of leather, he wrote with ink, making use of the alphabet of the Moabite stone and introducing such various readings as fancy dictated, the passages from Deuteronomy.
I love that.
Yeah. So he's saying, and he created this. He just, whatever fancy dictated. And so he goes on and he describes exactly what he believes take place. Yep.
Sorry to burst out laughing there, but that really is funny. He made variations as fancy dictated, as if someone is penning this and they're like, oh, hey, you know what? Wait. What if we make it and we'll write it like this, and it'll be different. That's good. Let's write that down. Anybody who has spent a reasonable amount of time not just examining the scroll and the paleography and all of this sort of stuff, but the actual theology of the document, would quickly realize the brilliance of it and the way that it is perfectly sewn together in narrative. That's not as if someone has just gone, I'm going to change the spelling of this. Oh, what if we put an I in at the beginning of Zamzamim? Oh, that'll be great.
Or what if we use a different word altogether? And why would you do that? Just to throw them a curveball. Why don't we just pick another word?
Words that we'll use that don't even appear in the Tanakh, let alone we'll write that one there. And what if we change the narrative and they don't sort of zigzag all over and we do all of the it's ridiculous. It is crazy to think that this was just made up. I thoroughly refuse to accept that. But,
now he notices.
Obviously, he didn't have the opportunity. But having said that, sorry to interrupt again. But he did have at least the transcripts, the translations of that Ginsburg was putting into the papers.
But remember, his focus for this initial blast he's not caring about what it says. He's not at all.
Clearly.
He doesn't really, other than a few jabs that just no substantiation for. He just says,
And how
yeah.
often is that
But
the case?
he's just looking at the external characteristics. This is
Mhm.
what he says. Even in a dark room, in a bit of time, I can determine that this is fake, and here it is. Here's why. But he doesn't really even get into what the internal characteristics of the scroll or what the scroll said. None of that even comes up, you see. Now, what he also says, and you alluded to it a moment ago, was he notices that on the strips, now remember there are 15, there's 16 strips, but only 15 that are at the British Museum at this time, at least out, and only 2 columns are on display. And so that's all he's got to look at. But he notices some things. And here's between the 2 that he sees in the dimly lit cabinet and what he saw on the table, he recognizes what he thinks is a smoking gun that leads him to this brilliant conclusion. And that is that if you look at the top, or if you look at one edge of the scroll, like here's my mock-up again. If you have this scroll, what he notices is that it's smoother on one end than on the other. So one appears to be maybe worn with age. The other, according to Clermont-Ganneau, is a razor cut almost. It's he says something's going on here.
It's interesting because, as we had mentioned, the Russian priest, right, that reported that the story that he heard was that it was in an earthen vessel.
Yeah.
Would suggest that the manuscript had been sitting upright for centuries, perhaps. And so, who knows how that would have altered the appearance of the document.
Look at any Dead Sea Scroll book. If you look at look at this. This is a perfect example. I don't know if you look on the cover of this. You see,
right, yeah, beautiful.
This on this particular scroll, what we see is we see something quite interesting because this is not staged. I didn't have this book here for any reason. This is a section from the Psalm scroll of Qumran Cave 11. And notice, if I had never seen a Dead Sea Scroll before, and I looked at this, I'd go, you know what? It looks like someone wants me to believe that this is ancient because you've got one tattered edge from antiquity, but it looks like somebody cut the top. Look at that. That's it. That's it. That's the same scroll. You
can just flick through any Dead Sea Scroll book.
Yep.
And that's just random flicking through, looking for an illustration, and lo and behold, there's one that represents that as well. Is this an opportune time just to talk about perhaps other scrolls that bear incredible similarity that was found in the Dead Sea, like the Paleo Leviticus? As far as dimension, and do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there are a couple of things that we can do to point people in the right direction. There are, I have the benefit of receiving quite a bit of updates and research from Matthew Hamilton, which we mention all the time. This is one of his specialties. In fact, it's one of the things that brought him into a study of the Shapira manuscript, because he is more broadly an expert on manuscripts, ancient manuscripts and so forth. So more generally, he knows all of this material. And one of the things that I think he would recommend, he sent me his own personal notes of several scrolls that fit this very description. One edge. In fact, the edge is like this, Jono. If you look, it's got sort of a slope to it. Like it's not a clean cut. It's like it's just kind of sloped,
it's
like
a little curved.
Curved, curved's sort of a better word.
Almost rainbowed.
Yeah,
slightly rainbowed.
And so we have that quite a few times. We see that among the Qumran manuscripts. There is an author a researcher by the name of Shlomo, Shlomo, Shlomo Gil, Guil. He wrote a paper. You can find it. It's free. You can get it on Academia. I think the title it's very close to this if it's not, but the Shapira manuscript is an authentic Dead Sea Scroll or something of that nature. And he brings
Mhm.
up this and many other factors which led him to believe that it is authentic. So the things that, now remember, Clermont-Ganneau is not my favorite person. However, Clermont-Ganneau is a brilliant scholar, well known and respected. Most people love him. They're not like me. Most people love him. I think, not so fondly of him. But having said that,
Certainly brilliant, though. I mean, we have
brilliant,
to say, I mean,
and
incredibly
look,
brilliant. Yeah.
they did not know, Jono. If you think of how ridiculous this story, they go, okay, say this again, Jono. You're telling me that a Bedouin was going into a cave and he found a black bundle. He thought it was gold. You're telling me that the scrolls were, and you think these are thousands of years old. Yeah. So it sounds crazy, but now, Jono, it doesn't sound so crazy, you see. So this is what's so good about this story. Now, but he goes on. He continues to make his point, and one of the things that he says is that he saw on the display, the two pieces that he gets to look at are connected by a seam with thread. Now, what he thinks, Jono, he says, look, I'm going to bring my example back in again. He says, if you take this, let's say there's a seam here, right here, and in fact, I could roll it a little bit and show you a seam, but he sees the thread, but he says it would be interesting to study this thread and just study this seam a little bit. He said, I can't do it because they won't let me, you figure why. But he's still sour about it, but he's saying somebody that gets a chance ought to look at this, and here's what he tells them to inspect. All right, you ready? This is how he tells them. This is going to be easy for you, the people that he lets. I advise all impartial scholars who would be thoroughly inform themselves as to this gross imposition. Okay, let me skip down. Okay, here's what it is. He says the trick will stare them in the face if they follow this, right? To number one, ascertain whether by chance there does not remain on the upper portion of the strips traces of the tail of Hebrew letters. In other words, if it's somebody really did cut, they're trying to maximize the scroll that they've got to produce the forgery. So he's saying, look at the very top. You're going to see, I think, traces of Hebrew letters, right? I mean, and that makes sense. You might find the ink. And then he says, look at the back and see if the material on the backside is different than the front, because he said, we know that scrolls are prepared on the writing side. We want to look at the other side, see if there's anything there. And then he says, take the average height of all the strips to obtain from them the greatest height, and that's going to help us determine the height of the original margin of the roll or rolls supplied by the forger. And he says this, I can at once affirm that on this roll, the column of square Hebrew characters were from 10 to 11 centimeters. So this is bigger than what Goethe says the width was, 3.9 to 4.3 inches. Okay. And bottom line, here's what he says. Nothing is more easy, Jono, I got to read this part, than to effect the experimental examination which I suggest. Let there be given me, the great Clermont-Ganneau, a synagogue roll, he didn't say that part, 2 or 3 centuries old, with permission to cut it up. I engage to procure from it strips in every respect similar to the Moabitish strips, and to transcribe upon them in archaic characters the text of Leviticus, for example, or one of Numbers. This would make a fitting sequel to the Deuteronomy of Mr. Shapira, but would have the slight advantage over it of not costing quite £1,000,000 sterling. What a jerk.
That is so fascinating. I wonder, as a result of that quote, if anyone has ever, I mean, I know there were people initially when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered that they said, oh, these are clearly fake. These are fake. I mean, because, we have this situation where we call Shapira's scroll a fake, therefore these are just trying to copy his and da-da-da-da-da. But we actually have, like I mentioned, a Paleo Leviticus.
Yeah.
And here's Clermont-Ganneau all this time back saying, "Oh, I could cut this off, and I could." And the dimensions of the Paleolithicus is akin to the dimensions of the Shapira scroll.
Yeah.
It would be easy for some uninformed individual to say, "Oh, well, clearly this is Clermont-Ganneau's
Forged Leviticus.
experiment, forged Leviticus." He never actually did do the experiment, though, did he? He did have an opportunity later to examine the scrolls and came up with different reasons as to why he believed them to be a forgery. But he does lay out for, as he says, for someone who has the opportunity to do it like this, and you will notice.
That's right.
And it is taken up by a scholar in our modern age. Do you want to talk about that at all?
I don't know.
Tegay.
Yeah, Tegay does.
You mentioned the phrase "smoking gun."
Yeah.
And,
do you have that in his book? Yeah, in his book.
His book.
What we're talking about is Hanan Tegay's book. It's the first book I read on this, and it left me with so many questions. I went and researched it further, ultimately writing the Moses Scroll. But what he says, he and many others have followed this theory of put forward first, as you'll see. He's not the last one in the 1800s that's going to say this exact story. Someone else is very soon going to come out with their theory as to why they think it's a forgery. But again, Hanan Tegay says not only does he think that this is what happened, that Shapira or whoever cut from the lower margin of one of the scrolls that just happened to have been in the possession of Shapira, and therefore that's how the forgery was produced. When I first read I wrote Hanan Tegay, and I don't know if he listens to these, but if he did, I want to thank him again for inspiring me to do the research and get a hold of the passionate part of my life here. But I didn't believe. I found it difficult to believe, and I wrote and said, I'm not questioning your integrity, but you said you found a manuscript that belonged at one time to Shapira that's in the Sutro Library in California, and you found a piece that was cut off. I'm curious, was the piece more than 20 feet long? Because you realize that it's got to be, in order to produce, it's not like you just cut one fragment. There were pieces of this that were, pretty long, that mounted to 5 columns of text. So if you found a scroll that you say is what he used to produce the forgery, I want to know, was it all of the manuscript, or did you just find a piece cut out? Because we have other examples of pieces that were cut out of other scrolls. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, this theory has been tested by Don Dershowitz, who basically shows that the scroll in question did indeed have a piece cut out of it, but it was because the scroll was out of use and it was water damaged very badly, and that was cut out to keep it from
decaying at the
getting
bottom.
Worse. Yeah,
because they stand upright.
That's right. Yeah.
And this itself is not unusual, but I can understand Tegay, having been given the by Ganneau saying this is the experiment that you've got to go and do. You're going to go and someone will go and find this scroll and they'll see the bottom cut off. And I can see Tegay going, oh, look, clearly this scroll has the bottom cut. Oh, this is it. This is the smoking gun.
Yeah.
But from what we know, as you're pointing out, about the very detailed records of the dimensions of the scroll and the condition of the scroll, and again the curvature of the scroll, does it match the scroll that Tegay was matching it to? And Dershowitz says no, it doesn't.
That's right. That's right. And so what we have, though, it's hard not to get into the test that he lays out. I mean, we kind of laid it out, but again, I want to stress that we're going to see later that Clermont-Ganneau, who said, look, it's real easy to show that this is a forgery. Boom, boom, boom. 3 steps. That's all it takes. Somebody that gets their hands on this, go do these things, and you'll be able to see. And then when he gets that opportunity, silence. None of those things are checked or at least commented on. So this is a very, very strange deal. But what happens, though, is Clermont-Ganneau, comes out with his decision, and he sends it off to the paper. He dates it the 18th, which is probably the end of Saturday, the 18th of August. Bond is in the country. I'm hoping, I'd like to think that at least Shapira is at the hotel observing Shabbat. Ginsburg may or may not be at the British Museum. I don't know. We just don't know, but we know that he wraps it up on this day, and then it's going to be published. Not because he drags his feet, but it just takes this long to get it in the lineup. It's going to be published on the 21st of August. Now, meanwhile, the second version, by the way, the second version came out this past Friday the 17th, Ginsburg's second publication of a section of the text. So again, look, everyone's still waiting, pins and needles. What's Ginsburg's decision? We don't know. We don't know.
And he has forced him into checkmate. Ganneau has, because Ganneau has said, look how quickly, with little analysis afforded to me, that I came to my correct conclusion that this is a forgery. Anyone should be able to tell this. And what he's really doing is giving Ginsburg a real dig in the ribs, saying, why aren't you as brilliant as I? What's taking you so long? Surely Ginsburg now is feeling the pressure. Not only is Bond saying, I have my doubts and I think you'll come to the same conclusion, even though I haven't spent the time analyzing the document as you have. And then Ganneau comes along going, I too have not spent that amount of time, 3 weeks, analyzing the doc, now approaching 4, but I can tell like that. Ginsburg must be feeling the public pressure of the fact that he has not come out to say whether or not he believes it to be authentic, Ross.
That's right. Yeah, he certainly, everything makes sense when you have all of the different reports at once, when you look at them side by side, and it becomes very clear that now, as we close this particular chapter in a way, and you still have other questions, that's fine, but as we come to this point, the end of the 18th of August, what we begin to see is that the pressure is beginning to rise on Ginsburg, not only to come out with something. The public is they're growing impatient. They're so excited. They want to know. They want to know. And yet he's just dragging them along. Meanwhile, you have other experts weighing in, and now, but Ginsburg begins to feel the pressure as soon as he gets the letter from the man paying his salary. I think you ought to think about this. I'm going to the country. So now, imagine.
Literally distancing himself from it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I'm going to be out of town for a couple of days. I expect to come back, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Yep.
So as you mentioned, Clermont-Ganneau, he writes this on the 18th. It's published on the 21st, and you conclude your chapter 9, saying, with these words, the Frenchman wished to distance himself from any potential accusation of a hastily determined position in his forthcoming public statement. However, he had given himself away by admitting that he had possessed doubts before arriving in London. One can almost hear echoes of a line from Shakespeare's Hamlet calling, Monsieur Clermont-Ganneau, thou dost protest too much, methinks. Clermont-Ganneau's report would not appear in the Times until the 21st, but the day was not yet over. So the day continues into chapter 10, thrice denied. Thrice, there's a word we don't get to use very often.
That's right.
Denied in 2 days. And we hear a little bit more from Captain Claude Condor. We're going to be doing that next week. Ross, is there anything else you want to mention before we go?
I tell you, just getting back into this and thinking about everything that has been said about this scroll, which the reasons for people declaring it inauthentic or forged, fake, however you want to put it. I'm also at this very moment, at this time in my life, doing a lot of research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we mentioned a few of the points here in this episode tonight. It's just that we now know so many things that the brilliant scholars of the day didn't know. And so many of the reasons that they declared it to be fake have been disproven now. And so that's what gets me. It's like you ever watch a sports game on TV or a movie, and you know that something's about to happen, and you're talking to the television set. When I read these stories again, I say, but if you only knew, because they just simply don't know. But again, I tell you, I think that all of the reasons, in fact, Tegay, I'm sorry, not Tegay, but in Idan Dershowitz's book, he says all of the reasons, he opens up with this basically, all of the reasons that were used to justify a forgery verdict, none of those count anymore. And yep.
No, I was just going to say, we've run out of time, but I would love to talk about, because I think it's kind of relevant, really. But perhaps we'll do this next week, or perhaps we'll do a separate program on this just as an update. But Galil's lead curse amulet, allegedly, of Mount Ebal has been in the papers again recently. And the winds of influence are moving away from it as an authentic artifact. There are some parallels that we can draw and compare in to this story, but we don't really have time to do that. But it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And by the way, that was one of the things that drew us to that story, and still have me with my ear to the ground on that story, because I've seen a scholar's name and reputation be besmirched. I've seen a scholarly consensus attack a scholar, in this sense, Shapira, and everybody side against him, and ultimately he be proven right. So I've held out judgment, certainly public denouncement, and said, let's let the evidence come forward. What we see in this particular case that you're talking about is more and more and more and more people who even at one time were fully behind Professor Galil are now saying, I knew all along this was, and it just, it could very well be that is the case, but I'm just holding out because I'm thinking, this sounds pretty familiar to me. And, but
you know what I would love? You know what I would love to do?
What's that?
And this is, I don't want to, trail off onto this topic, but it would be fascinating to take because we do have an enormous amount of lead fishing weights, other fishing weights, and subject them to the same tests and see if we can make out
any
what
letters
looks like Paleo-Hebrew letters. Let's just do the same thing with those that we did with Professor Galil's lead amulet, and see if they produce similar results. And if they do, I think we can lay it to rest. In any case, there we go.
Hey, good stuff. And speaking of our friend Professor Galil, I need to try to get in touch with him and ask him, where is the book? On these inscriptions in
this is not helping him.
Hezekiah's tunnel.
It's not helping him. He's got to produce the book and come forth with the evidence of his claims. When you hold this, isn't the difference, Ross? Shapira immediately brings forward this and sends a transcript to Schlottmann and says, "Look what I've got. This is just an amazing thing." Schlottmann scares him back into his shell. He puts it in a bank vault. He doesn't sell it off or anything like this because he still thinks that it's incredibly valuable. Leaves it in a bank vault for 5 years. And then when he is emboldened by reading Bleek's introduction to the Old Testament, he's like, no, I am going to bring this. I'm going to bring this to the experts. And he does. He rushes to all the experts and look at it. Have a go. Check it out. Not you, Ganneau, but everyone else. It's all right. But he's not holding back, and the transcripts are coming out. The translations are coming out. Everybody can analyze it. The Prime Minister. Here we have Galil, who's making extraordinary claims in regards to Hezekiah's tunnel and all of this sort of stuff. New inscriptions that he has found, and all. Well, show them to us, please. Bring out the book, please. The longer you wait, the more suspicious it looks.
Well, I look forward to it, and I tell you, it is a case for our day. I mean, it's a big deal.
Yeah,
If it's right,
I really want
you and I both said we pray, we hope that it's real, that he
I
has
hope it's
seen
real.
what he sees and he can prove and blah
Yeah.
blah blah.
Mm,
But that is another story, and in a way, it's
it is.
connected to the Shapira story because Shapira is in that tunnel. The Siloam inscription, he's not only involved in it, but he is a key player in it who just never got the credit where credit was due.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm.
man, I tell you what,
All
Jono,
right.
let's
You
do
wait and
this.
watch.
Let's if you'll agree to meet me next week, we'll come back
gonna do it.
and we'll take it the next step.
We will be back this time next week. In the meantime, dear viewers, so we have been in touch with our land operator in Israel. We are currently working on reservations now
Yep.
in Egypt, Jordan, Israel. The end of February into the beginning of March next year. I was going to say next week. Next year, 2025. Details at tanaktours.com. We would love for you to come with us. There is room for Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. You can do Egypt, Jordan. You can do Israel. You can do them both. And there's a discount. There's a combination discount if you want to throw those two together, as many people are. Tanaktours.com, Tanakh, tanaktours.com. We'll give you the details and join us in the Holy Land, and it's going to be great.
That's right. Now, look, members of the Yakad, meet us in Discord, and we're going to have a little conversation. Yep. You got a few minutes, Jono? Let's do it.
See you next week.
All right. See you next time.